You are a priest in the year 1396, standing in the cold stone halls of Westminster Abbey. The air is heavy with the scent of incense, mingling with the scent of wet stone as the damp autumn chill wraps around you. Your breath, visible in the brisk air, puffs out in small clouds as you clutch your prayer book tightly, your hands trembling slightly. You are a witness to a most unusual event, one that will be whispered about in court for generations to come, as servants scurry about, preparing for what will be the most extraordinary royal wedding England has ever witnessed. You can hear the rustling of silks and the clatter of metal, the sound of nobles and knights moving through the hallways. Whispers of awe and disbelief circulate among the attendants. The bride has arrived from France, they say, a princess, daughter of King Charles himself, though her age raises many eyebrows. The foreign ambassadors and court diplomats have already begun to murmur about the great political significance of this union, but your heart cannot help but wonder what awaits the innocent child at the altar. The doors swing open with a groan, and your gaze is drawn toward the procession. The groom, King Richard II of England, is a man who cuts an impressive figure. He is 29, tall, regal, and with golden hair that seems to shimmer in the filtered light of the abbey. He walks with grace, his every movement measured and deliberate, a king who has known both tragedy and triumph. His face holds the weight of the crown, his expression one of solemnity, yet there is something else, something softer when he turns his eyes to the girl beside him. She is a tiny figure, barely more than a child, standing at his side. She seems so fragile, her tiny hand engulfed by his gloved palm. A child bride, barely 6 or 7 years old, this little princess who will soon be crowned Queen of England. She walks beside him, her French gown rich with delicate embroidery, pearls adorning her dark hair, weighing down the braids that fall delicately to her shoulders. There is nothing royal in the way she clutches her gown, in the way she shifts on her feet, and yet in her eyes, there is a curious wonder as she looks around the grand space, so different from the court she must have known. Your heart stirs with an unease that you cannot shake. You steady yourself against the altar rail, watching her take tentative steps toward the crown she will wear, wondering what fate awaits this child, this queen. She is Isabella of Valois, daughter of the mad King Charles VI of France and the new Queen of England. As the ceremony begins, you cannot help but wonder if this union will truly bring peace, or whether it is nothing more than a marriage of political necessity. You hear Richard speak his vows, his voice gentle, yet firm, almost protective. This is no monster taking a child bride for base desires. He is a king fulfilling his duty, fulfilling his role as a ruler who must secure peace with France, who must maintain the delicate balance of power between two kingdoms torn by the 100 Years' War. The marriage will not be consummated. Everyone knows this. It is an agreement and alliance, a temporary union that will allow the child queen to grow into her role, to mature in both mind and body until she is ready to rule alongside her husband. The political stability of two nations hangs in the balance, and this young girl, though unaware of her immense responsibility, will shape the course of history in ways she cannot yet comprehend. As you bless their union with a steady voice, you cannot help but feel a pang of sorrow for the child, so small, so unaware, stepping into a world where power, politics, and survival are governed by forces much larger than herself. What will become of her in this dangerous game of royal politics? And yet, despite the weight of it all, you can't deny the beauty of the moment. The grandeur of the abbey, the flickering candles casting dancing shadows on the walls, the soaring arches above you, all of it seems to fade away as you focus solely on the child who will become Queen of England. The child who, for now, is simply that, a child, thrust into a role she cannot yet understand. You watch in silence, your breath misting the air, knowing that in this very moment, history is being made, and that this story, this unusual marriage between a child and a king, will echo through the centuries to come. The abbey is still, the air heavy with the murmur of prayers and quiet anticipation as the ceremony begins. You, along with the other witnesses, watch intently as Isabella, the young bride, is led to the altar. Her eyes are wide, and though she seems mostly unafraid, there is a hesitancy in her step, a child's hesitancy in a room filled with strangers and expectations. Richard stands tall beside her, his regal presence overshadowing her tiny figure. His gaze occasionally falls on her with a tenderness that surprises you. He, too, is a child of the court, but one whose experience has shaped him into a ruler far beyond his years. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, has only just passed, and the grief of her loss still hangs in the air around him. The ceremony with Isabella is not one of joy or affection, but of duty. Duty to the kingdom, duty to secure the peace with France, and duty to ensure the survival of the throne itself. As the priest reads the vows, Richard's voice is soft but steady. There is a sincerity in his words, though they are spoken not to the girl standing next to him, but to the people and the power he represents. This marriage, as you know, will not be one of passion. It will not be one of love, at least, not in the way most people understand it. It is a political move, a strategic alliance designed to end the long-running conflict with France. And while it may not be a marriage founded in affection, it is nonetheless an important bond between two nations. Isabella, on the other hand, seems to float through the ceremony in a daze. The enormity of the situation is far beyond her understanding. At just 6 years old, she is too young to comprehend the weight of the vows being spoken on her behalf. She gazes around, taking in the grand architecture of Westminster Abbey, the glimmer of the stained glass windows, and the flickering candles that illuminate the space in an almost ethereal glow. She watches as the crowd of nobles, knights, and courtiers look at her with fascination. Some wonder what kind of queen she will become, others wonder what kind of kingdom she will inherit. For now, she is an enigma, a puzzle piece in a much larger gamma game she does not yet know how to play. As Richard speaks his vows, his voice softens when he turns to her. It is a rare moment of gentleness, and it is not lost on the few who notice. His eyes meet hers, and for just a moment, you see something in his gaze, something akin to protection. Perhaps it is sympathy, or perhaps it is the reflection of his own feelings of loss and isolation. As he lifts her chin gently, offering her a reassuring smile, it is as though he sees her not as a political pawn, but as a child in need of care. This gesture, simple yet tender, stands in contrast to the nature of their union. When the vows are complete, and the ring is placed on her tiny finger, you hear the familiar words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." And with those words, the young Isabella becomes Queen of England, though she has no understanding of the power now vested in her. Her future will be shaped not by her own desires, but by the forces of diplomacy and royal politics. Forces that will mold her life in ways she cannot yet fathom. The ceremony ends with little fanfare, but the weight of the occasion is not lost on you. It is not a wedding filled with joy, but one marked by the heavy responsibility of statecraft, and as the two of them walk from the altar, you wonder what the future holds for this young girl who has been thrust into such a monumental role. What will become of her, this child queen? Will she grow into the powerful queen consort she is expected to be, or will she fade into the shadows of history as so many other royal brides before her? For now, the world watches, waiting for what comes next. Isabella of Valois was born on November 9, 1389, at the Louvre Palace in Paris, into a world steeped in political instability and personal tragedy. Her father, King Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad, was not the strong, unyielding ruler one would expect to protect a young princess. Instead, he was a man plagued by bouts of madness that would turn his kingdom into a land of fear and confusion. Imagine the court of France with its opulent grandeur and terrifying instability. A young Isabella must have grown up watching her father's erratic behavior, the frightening episodes that turned the once mighty king into a broken shell of a man. Sometimes, he believed he was made of glass, terrified that any movement would cause him to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Other times, he would lose all sense of reality, unable to recognize even his closest advisors, let alone his own children. These episodes sent ripples of terror through the French court, leaving Isabella with vivid memories of her father's fractured psyche. In one moment, he might be the benevolent king, offering her jewels and affection. In the next, he would cower in corners, shouting that assassins were coming for him, or stand motionless for hours, consumed by the belief that moving would cause him to break apart. The servants would scramble, ushering the children away during these frightening episodes, But the fear never left Isabella's mind. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was a formidable woman, a queen who tried to maintain some semblance of order amidst the chaos. Beautiful, intelligent, and politically savvy, Isabel knew that her children, particularly Isabella, held the key to crucial political alliances. While Charles was lost to his madness, Isabel was working tirelessly to ensure that her daughter would marry well and secure her place in the ever-shifting world of European politics. But the court's instability was not just a personal tragedy for Isabella. It was a reflection of the larger political turmoil France was facing. For nearly 60 years, England and France had been embroiled in the 100 Years' War, a devastating conflict that had left both kingdoms exhausted and on the brink of collapse. French villages were razed by English raids, and England, financially drained from the constant warfare, had little left to give. The war was no longer just about territory or the throne. It had become a battle for national identity, pride, and survival. By the time Isabella was born, the possibility of peace was a distant dream. Yet, the key to that peace lay within her, a child whose future was bound to the outcome of this war. Her marriage would not only represent a personal union between two royal families, but would become a symbol of the fragile hope for a lasting peace, one that could only be achieved through the most delicate of alliances. As the child of such a troubled monarch, Isabella's fate was sealed from birth. She was born into a world of diplomacy, where every action, every marriage, had the potential to change the course of history. Her beauty and royal blood made her an invaluable asset, a pawn in the political game played by the great monarchs of Europe. Yet despite her outwardly privileged life, Isabella's childhood was one marked by uncertainty, instability, and a growing awareness that she would one day be thrust into the heart of political conflict. She was the daughter of a mad king, raised in the shadow of fear and madness, and yet she was also the symbol of hope for her mother, for her country, and for the future of peace between France and England. But how could a young girl understand such weighty matters? How could she, in her youth, comprehend the political chess game that would shape her life? The reality, as Isabella would soon learn, was that her life, her marriage, her role as queen was never truly hers to control. It was a political tool, a bargaining chip in the endless struggle between two kingdoms desperate for peace. And this truth would be the first of many painful lessons she would learn in her brief and tumultuous life. The 100 Years' War between England and France had ravaged both kingdoms for decades, leaving a trail of death, destruction, and diplomatic exhaustion in its wake. Entire villages in France lay in ruins from English raids, while English nobles spent vast fortunes funding campaigns across the Channel. By the 1390s, the war had become more than just a territorial dispute. It was a bitter struggle for national identity, economic dominance, and the survival of both kingdoms. The toll on the people was incalculable, with entire generations lost to battle and disease. In the midst of this chaos, a fragile peace was a distant dream, and yet it was one that both nations desperately needed. The English treasury was drained, their military forces exhausted, while France, though still wealthy and populous, was nearing its breaking point. The weary monarchs of both kingdoms knew that only a peace forged through the marriage of royal blood could bring the conflict to a close. It was in this desperate context that Isabella of Valois found herself thrust into a world of politics and war. As the daughter of Charles VI, the unstable king of France, Isabella was not merely a child bride awaiting a happily ever after. She was a pawn in the game of European diplomacy, a symbol of hope and reconciliation between two war-torn nations. Her marriage to Richard II, King of England, was not born out of affection but out of necessity. The French, exhausted by years of fighting, proposed an audacious plan. They would offer Isabella, their young daughter, in marriage to Richard, a king still grieving the loss of his first wife. In return, they would demand a dowry of 800,000 francs, an extraordinary sum that would replenish England's depleted treasury and, most importantly, a 28-year truce, long enough to ensure that a new generation of English and French children would grow up knowing peace instead of war. The idea of marrying off a 6-year-old to a man nearly 5 times her age might seem bizarre today, but in the context of medieval diplomacy, it was a common practice. Marriages were political alliances, carefully crafted to secure peace, wealth, and power. In a world where royal children were considered assets, the youth of a bride was seen as an advantage rather than a hindrance. Isabella, still a child, would be raised in England, learning English customs and loyalties, growing into her role as queen consort over time. By the time she reached maturity, the hope was that she would be as much English as French. Richard II, for his part, was initially resistant to the idea. He had loved his first wife, Anne of Bohemia, deeply, and the thought of remarrying so soon after her death left him conflicted. But the political pressure was undeniable. His advisors urged him to marry again, to secure the future of the English throne and ensure the survival of the monarchy. When the French proposal came, Richard knew he had little choice. The marriage would solidify England's position in the war-torn landscape of Europe, cementing a tenuous peace with France and allowing Richard to focus on other, more pressing issues such as the growing threat from Scotland and the ever-present instability in Ireland. The peace with France was crucial, not only for the survival of Richard's reign, but for the future of England itself. Despite the political necessity of the marriage, Richard's feelings toward the young Isabella were far from cold. In court, some whispered that he saw in her not just a political asset but a chance to be a father again, something he had lost with the death of his beloved Anne. Though the marriage was never meant to be consummated until Isabella came of age, there was a sense of protectiveness in Richard's demeanor. He was a king, yes, but also a man who had suffered personal loss, and perhaps, beneath the layers of politics, there was a flicker of kindness in his heart. The negotiations between the English and French ambassadors dragged on for months. Each detail scrutinized, each clause debated and redrafted. The terms of Isabella's future life were carefully outlined. She would retain her French servants, maintain her French customs, and stay in correspondence with her family. Most crucially, it was agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until she reached physical maturity, a provision that was explicitly written into the treaty to protect her innocence. Meanwhile, Isabella, unaware of the vast political machinations taking place around her, continued to play with her dolls in the lavish court of France. Her tutors began teaching her English phrases, and seamstresses began work on the elaborate trousseau she would bring to England. She was told that she would soon marry a great king, but at the age of 6, the reality of that statement was as abstract to her as the fairy tales her nurses told her at bedtime. When the momentous day of her wedding arrived, Isabella was only 7 years old. The ceremony took place not once, but twice, a reflection of the political complexity of the union. The first ceremony, held in the neutral ground of Cala, an English-controlled port in French territory, was an intimate affair attended by high-ranking nobles and diplomats from both kingdoms. Isabella wore a gown of cloth of gold, embroidered with pearls so heavy that she could barely walk without assistance. As Richard knelt to her level and exchanged rings, he lifted her chin gently when she seemed frightened by the assembly of nobles around her. It was a rare moment of tenderness, and it stood in stark contrast to the political machinery that had brought them together. A year later, when Isabella was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey, the ceremony was nothing short of spectacular. It was not just a coronation, it was a statement that this young girl, though so small and so fragile, would one day rule a nation. The English people, curious and captivated by their new child queen, gathered in droves to witness the coronation, and the streets of London were lined with spectators eager to catch a glimpse of the young queen as she processed to Westminster. In her tiny crown, wearing a gown so grand that she could scarcely move in it, Isabella smiled and waved to the crowds, though she barely understood their language. She had been taught to act the part, to show poise and dignity in front of the thousands who had come to see her. But in truth, the weight of the crown was more than she could comprehend. Her coronation was not just an event, it was a symbol of the delicate, fleeting peace between two kingdoms. And as the festivities unfolded, with feasts and entertainments that lasted for days, the court buzzed with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Could this fragile child, raised in the shadow of war, truly bring about the peace that everyone so desperately wanted? The marriage of Isabella to Richard II was not one born of love or mutual affection, but rather a brilliant, albeit controversial political maneuver. Behind the grand ceremonies and royal pageantry lay a marriage steeped in strategy, one designed to end a war that had raged for nearly 60 years. The 100 Years' War between England and France had drained both nations, leaving them impoverished and weary. At its heart, the war was about more than just territorial claims. It had become a struggle for dominance, pride, and survival. As the war raged on, both kingdoms began to understand that a lasting peace would only be achieved through a series of irreversible alliances sealed through the marriages of royal blood. In this context, the marriage of Isabella to Richard became an essential piece in a much larger puzzle. The French were desperate to end the conflict, and Isabella, as the eldest daughter of the troubled King Charles VI, was a key diplomatic asset. The proposal that came from France was bold. The French offered not only their princess in marriage, but a dowry of 800,000 francs, an extraordinary sum, considering England's strained finances. The terms of the marriage were simple but powerful. Isabella would marry Richard and, in exchange, England would receive both peace and financial relief. The offer of a 28-year truce long enough to allow an entire generation to grow up without knowing the horrors of war was the real prize. The French diplomats understood that this peace, secured through the young Isabella's marriage, would benefit both nations for years to come. But this alliance was not without its critics. Some within the English court were wary of the young age of the bride. At just 6 years old, Isabella was far too young by medieval standards to be married, let alone crowned queen. The English nobles feared that such a marriage would bring scandal, both within their kingdom and across the courts of Europe. Yet, the political pressure was overwhelming, and Richard, despite his initial resistance, could not ignore the weight of his advisors' counsel. Richard's personal grief over the loss of his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, further complicated matters. Anne had been deeply adored by the English people, and her untimely death had left Richard not only without an heir, but also emotionally adrift. His advisors urged him to remarry quickly, but the king hesitated, mourning the loss of a woman he had truly loved. His resistance to remarrying was rooted not in a desire to remain loyal to Anne's memory, but in the pain of moving on from a wife he had cherished. However, the political realities of his reign soon became impossible to ignore. England needed an heir, and Richard needed peace. When the French ambassadors presented their proposal, Richard's advisors saw it as the perfect solution. A young bride, a large dowry, and a long-lasting truce. It was a deal too good to pass up. The negotiations were long and difficult, with diplomats from both sides haggling over every detail. The terms of Isabella's future life in England were carefully laid out. She would retain her French servants, maintain her French customs, and most importantly, the marriage would not be consummated until she reached maturity. This clause was explicitly written into the agreement, to protect her from the physical realities of a marriage with a much older man. For Isabella, however, the gravity of the situation was far beyond her understanding. At 6 years old, she was a pawn in a political game she had no power to control. She played with dolls in the lavish French court, unaware that her future was being decided by grown men in far-off council chambers. She was told that she was to marry a great king across the sea, but at that age, such promises were as intangible as the fairy tales her nurses whispered to her before bed. Despite her ignorance of the full extent of her political significance, Isabella's beauty and royal blood were powerful tools in the hands of those who sought peace. She was not just a child bride, but a symbol of hope, a living emblem of the possibility of reconciliation between two nations torn apart by war. Her marriage would be a living testament to the fragile peace that could only be sealed through the union of two royal houses. Richard, for his part, could not help but feel a sense of responsibility toward Isabella. Though he was nearly 5 times her age, there was a sense of duty that transcended the political nature of their union. He was not just taking a bride, he was taking on the role of protector and guardian of this young girl, whose fate was now inextricably tied to the future of both England and France. His decision to marry Isabella, while politically necessary, was also a reflection of his own inner conflict. He had lost one wife to illness, and now he was marrying a child to secure the peace that had eluded Europe for so long. The French diplomats, too, understood the importance of this marriage, but they also recognized the risks. Isabella, though young, would be raised at the English court. She would learn English customs, adopt English loyalties, and, over time, become as much English as French. The marriage, in the eyes of the French, would symbolize not just a political alliance, but a new beginning, free from the bitter memories of war. For Isabella, it would mean the end of one life and the beginning of another, in a foreign land, under the watchful eye of a king who, though kind, was bound by duty. Her role was clear: she would be the bridge between two nations, a symbol of peace, even if she did not fully understand it herself. The child bride of Richard II would one day grow into a queen whose name would be written in the annals of history, not for the love she shared with her husband, but for the peace her marriage helped to secure. As the months passed and the negotiations continued, Isabella's life began to shift. Her tutors began teaching her English, preparing her for the life she would soon lead. Seamstresses worked tirelessly to craft a trousseau worthy of a queen, while court officials debated the finer details of her future role. For now, though, Isabella remained blissfully unaware of the weight of her impending marriage, content to play in the palace and learn her lessons, unaware that the tides of history were rapidly shifting around her. And so, the stage was set for the historic union between Isabella and Richard, an event that would change the course of both their lives, and perhaps the future of two great nations. The negotiations were fraught with tension. This marriage, one of the most unusual in English history, was not simply a union of two people, it was a political lifeline for both nations, a momentous decision that would affect the fate of kingdoms. For Richard, it was the key to peace. For Isabella, it was a future she could not yet understand. Behind the ornate words of the diplomats and the dazzling gowns of the courtiers, the political ramifications were clear. This was a marriage that would define the course of the 100 Years' War and perhaps, in the long run, alter the trajectory of both the French and English monarchies. When the French ambassadors first presented the proposal to Richard's court, it was met with disbelief and resistance. Marrying a child one so young she had not yet reached puberty was not just an unusual move, it was an unsettling one. Many in Richard's court, particularly the older nobles, felt a sense of discomfort at the idea of a king marrying a girl who was still in the cradle of childhood. However, the political situation left them with little room for protest. The French dowry alone, 800,000 francs, was an amount so substantial that it would relieve England's war-depleted treasury, filling its coffers and providing an essential lifeline. The negotiations continued for months, with each detail of Isabella's life after marriage meticulously outlined. She would retain her French servants and customs, ensuring that her French identity remained intact despite her new life in England. But more importantly, it was agreed that the marriage would not be consummated until Isabella reached physical maturity. This safeguard was written explicitly into the treaty, and for Isabella, it was a protection against a world far more complex than her young mind could comprehend. Richard, who had suffered deeply from the death of his beloved Anne, was initially resistant to marrying again. His marriage to Anne had been based on love and affection, a rare and cherished bond in a world where political marriages were the norm. To replace Anne, so soon after her death, felt like a betrayal of her memory. And yet, the political weight of the situation was inescapable. Richard's advisors urged him to remarry quickly, not only to ensure the security of the throne but to secure peace with France, which had been one of England's bitterest enemies for decades. The French proposal, while audacious, was presented not as a mere political exchange, but as an opportunity to end the war. By offering their daughter in marriage, the French hoped to close the chapter of hostility that had defined their relationship with England. The long-lasting peace that came with the proposed truce of 28 years was a tantalizing prospect for both sides. For France, it would bring stability. For England, it would relieve the pressure of constant warfare. As the months passed, Richard found himself increasingly drawn to the idea, not just as a political necessity, but as a means of preserving the fragile stability of his kingdom. And there, hidden beneath the cold political calculus, was a sense of compassion toward the child who would become his queen. Although he did not yet know her, there was a sense of responsibility that Richard felt for Isabellian, almost paternal instinct to protect her. The whispers in court, those that suggested he was acting out of some latent desire to be a father figure, were not entirely without merit. As the proposal progressed, the practicalities of the marriage began to take shape. Isabella, still a child in every sense of the word, would be raised at the English court. She would be educated in English language and customs, learning the etiquette of English nobility, all while retaining her French identity. The political advantages were Claire Isabella would grow into a queen who was equally at home in both kingdoms, a symbol of unity between two nations that had been divided by war for over half a century. But the price of such a union was not only a young child's life and future, but also the lives of those who would be affected by it. There were those within the English court who felt that such a marriage would scandalize even the medieval nobility, that the sight of a child queen would undermine the dignity of the English crown. But Richard, though mindful of such concerns, knew that the weight of the decision lay not in the approval of the court, but in the larger consequences for England and the future of his rule. Isabella, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware of the grand negotiations taking place in distant council chambers. To her, the idea of marrying Richard, the King of England, was as distant and unreal as the fairy tales she had heard as a child. She had been told that she was going to marry a great king, and though the idea filled her with a vague sense of wonder, she was too young to understand the implications. She played with her dolls in the royal court, her world still filled with the simplicity of childhood, unaware that her every move, her every word, was being watched and debated by the great powers of Europe. For Isabella, the marriage proposal was a far-off fantasy, something far removed from the reality of her daily life. She would not yet understand the complexities of the treaty or the political weight of a marriage. All she knew was that she was being prepared for something momentous, something that would change the course of her life forever. And so, as the negotiations continued and the details of her future were ironed out, Isabella's life began to shift. Her French tutors taught her English phrases and courtly manners, preparing her for her new role as queen. Seamstresses worked tirelessly on her trousseau, crafting gowns befitting the Queen of England, while the English court buzzed with speculation and curiosity about the young girl who would soon become their queen. But what no one knew, least of all Isabella, was the profound impact this marriage would have not just on her life, but on the future of two great kingdoms. The political calculations that underpinned her betrothal were monumental, and while Isabella was still a child, her life had already become inextricably tied to the fate of England and France. On October 31st, 1396, Isabella of Valois, just 7 years old, stood at the altar in a ceremony that would become one of the most remarkable in English history. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a moment frozen in time, a pivotal event in the turbulent history of the 100 Years' War. The marriage of Isabella to Richard II, despite the many political machinations surrounding it, was not one of love, but of peace, a desperate attempt to bind to warring nations through the fragile threads of diplomacy. The ceremony took place not in the grand halls of Westminster Abbey, but in the small, English-controlled port of Calais on French soil. The choice of location was not incidental, it was neutral ground, a compromise that reflected the delicate nature of the marriage. Here, in the Great Hall of Calais Castle, Isabella would marry Richard in a ceremony that, although modest, would signal the hope of an entire generation. For the English, it was a chance for peace. For the French, it was the opportunity to finally end the devastation of the war. As Isabella stood beside Richard, her gown of cloth of gold, heavy with pearls and embroidery, she was the very picture of royal dignity. Though to anyone who looked closely, the innocence of childhood still shone in her eyes, she was barely old enough to comprehend the enormity of the moment, let alone the significance of the alliance she was about to enter. The weight of her crown, though figuratively placed, would not be felt until many years later. But in this moment, she was not a queen. She was a child, standing at the beginning of a journey that would take her from the innocent court of France to the complex, often perilous world of English politics. Richard, despite the strangeness of the situation, was gentle with her. As he knelt before her, offering the rings that would seal their union, there was a tenderness in his gaze, a protectiveness. It was a rare and tender moment between the two, and though their union was purely political, in that instant, Richard seemed to see Isabella not as a political pawn, but as a young girl who needed care and guidance. The sight of Richard, the King of England, kneeling to a child bride seemed almost anachronistic, an emblem of the innocence that was too often lost in the harsh realities of medieval politics. Witnesses to the ceremony would later note how carefully Richard lifted Isabella's chin, his actions far more fatherly than royal. It was an expression of tenderness that contrasted sharply with the usual cold, detached nature of political marriages. In that brief exchange, there was a shared understanding this was not a union of equals in any traditional sense, but one forged out of necessity, and for the time being, it would be Richard's duty to guide and protect this fragile girl who was soon to become the Queen of England. As the vows were exchanged, the solemnity of the occasion settled over the hall. The ceremony, though small, was no less significant than the great royal weddings of the age. But for Isabella, it was as if the world around her had transformed into something surreal. The intricacies of court etiquette, the formalities of her wedding day, would have felt like distant echoes in her mind, abstract, almost dreamlike. She had not yet grown into the role she was expected to play, and yet, in that instant she was irrevocably tied to a future that was far beyond her understanding. Isabella's coronation, a year later, would be far grander, more public, more formal, but the first ceremony, in the neutral ground of Cala, had set the stage for the next chapter in Isabella's life. It was a quiet beginning to what would become a very public and politically charged reign. The wedding in Cala marked her official entrance into the world of royal politics, where her personal wishes and desires would be secondary to the needs of the crown and the kingdom. The simplicity of the ceremony belied its profound impact. For England, it was a diplomatic victory. Richard's decision to marry the young princess symbolized England's newfound commitment to peace with France. The prospect of a 28-year truce was a welcome reprieve from the endless bloodshed that had defined the war, and Isabella, despite being little more than a child, was the vessel of that peace. And yet, the wedding also marked the beginning of Isabella's life as a political symbol, one that would eventually become a pawn in the cruel game of royal politics. She was no longer just a child in a foreign court. From the moment she exchanged vows with Richard, she became a queen, though she did not yet know the responsibilities that came with the title. For the English people, the marriage to a foreign princess, particularly one so young, was an oddity, something that caused whispers and raised eyebrows. Many wondered whether this fragile, tiny girl would ever become a queen in the true sense of the word. Would she ever have the strength to lead, to command, or would she forever remain a symbol of the political necessities of the age? The English people, despite their initial curiosity and skepticism, soon found themselves captivated by Isabella's youthful presence. They had heard rumors of the child queen who would unite two kingdoms, and they eagerly awaited the day when she would officially take her place at the heart of the English monarchy. That day would come soon, with Isabella's coronation in Westminster Abbey. But for now, she remained a curious figure in the pages of history, an innocent child thrust into a world far beyond her comprehension. As Isabella left the chapel of Cala, her tiny hand in Richard's, the weight of the crown still beyond her understanding, one could not help but wonder what the future held for this little queen. Would she grow into her role as consort to the King of England, or would she be forever overshadowed by the political forces at play? Only time would tell. A year after the quiet wedding at Cala, Isabella's destiny as Queen of England was formalized with the grand ceremony of her coronation in Westminster Abbey. Unlike the intimate wedding held on French soil, this event would draw massive crowds to the heart of London. The English people, curious and eager to catch a glimpse of their new child queen, filled the streets. Isabella's arrival marked the culmination of months of preparation, anticipation, and political maneuvering. Though she had already been married to Richard for over a year, her coronation symbolized her official ascension to the throne. The streets of London were lined with spectators who craned their necks to see the child who had become the center of a diplomatic union. The people whispered of their new queen, the little girl from France who would unite two warring nations. The fact that she was just 7 years old did little to dampen the excitement that filled the city. It was a momentous occasion for a city weary of war and eager for peace, and Isabella, despite her tender age, became the symbol of that peace. As she processed through the streets of London in a royal litter, her tiny form barely visible beneath the weight of her crown, the English people hailed her arrival. The crowd cheered, calling out blessings in a language she was only just beginning to understand. Isabella, for her part, waved back, her smile a mix of politeness and curiosity. She was still so young, her grasp of the political significance of her new position was limited to what had been carefully drilled into her by her tutors and caretakers. Yet, despite the uncertainty in her heart, she played her part to perfection, as a queen must. The coronation ceremony itself, held in Westminster Abbey, was a spectacle unlike any other. It was designed to show both the English nobility and foreign dignitaries that this peculiar marriage had the full support of the crown. The lavish decorations and the grandeur of the occasion were meant to send a powerful message. Isabella was not just a child bride, but the Queen of England, and her marriage to Richard symbolized the kingdom's renewed commitment to peace. The English court, as well as foreign representatives from across Europe, watched as Isabella was crowned with a crown specially made for her small head. The coronation was a blend of tradition and necessity, ceremonial rites that had been performed for centuries, but now infused with a new layer of meaning. The coronation of Isabella was not merely a religious or royal ritual. It was the manifestation of hope, belief that the union between England and France would endure, that the bloodshed of the past was behind them. Despite her youth, Isabella was placed at the high table at the coronation feast, sitting beside Richard. The banquet that followed was a lavish affair, filled with entertainment, musicians, jugglers, and theatrical performances that depicted the bright future the marriage was meant to ensure. The nobles toasted the health of their young queen, their voices filled with both curiosity and skepticism. How long could this fragile peace last? And what role would Isabella, a girl so young, play in the politics of the realm? As Isabella sat at the table, delicately picking at her food with the manners drilled into her by her French tutors, she had little comprehension of the full weight of her position. For her, the coronation feast was an event much like any other royal gathering, albeit one with far more formality and grandeur. She had been trained to behave as a queen, to show grace and dignity even in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. Her new life in England, though filled with new experiences, had yet to fully reveal itself to her, but there were whispers among the courtiers, too. Experienced nobles, long accustomed to the delicate balance of royal power, began to question how long the peace between the two nations would last. Richard's reign was already marked by growing dissatisfaction from his own nobles. Many believed Richard's favoring of his favorites and his focus on negotiation over conquest were signs of weakness. The coronation was a display of royal unity, but beneath the surface, tensions were brewing both in the court and in the kingdom. For Isabella, the coronation feast was the first of many such events she would attend as queen, but it was also the beginning of her role as a political figure, a role she was still too young to fully understand. She would spend her days learning the intricacies of court life, honing her skills in diplomacy, language, and etiquette. She would be molded into the queen consort that her marriage was intended to create, a symbol of the fragile peace that England so desperately needed. But for now, in the midst of the lavish celebrations, Isabella was still a child. Her laughter, though polite, was that of a girl who had been thrust into a world far beyond her understanding. The peace she represented was something that had been achieved through her, but she could not yet grasp the full extent of her significance. The future, with all its uncertainties, was something she would come to know as she matured, as she navigated the dangerous waters of royal politics and learned what it truly meant to be queen. And so, the coronation came to an end, leaving behind a mixture of awe and uncertainty in its wake. The streets of London, filled with cheer for their young queen, would soon return to their everyday rhythms. Yet for Isabella, her life would never be the same. She was no longer just a child in a foreign land. She was Queen of England, a position that would require her to grow up far faster than any child should. The weight of that responsibility would become apparent in the years to come, but for now, she remained a child with the crown of England on her head, uncertain of the future but bound by duty to carry it forward. Isabella's life at the English court, after her coronation, was a complex blend of training, learning, and gradual acclimatization to a world she had never known. The grand halls of Westminster, where she had been crowned just a year earlier, now became the space in which her future as Queen of England was to be shaped. At just 7 years old, Isabella was far too young to truly understand the depths of her position. But the weight of her crown, though figuratively placed, was always with her, even if it did not yet feel heavy. Each day was filled with instruction. Isabella was carefully tutored in English, a language that sounded foreign to her ears, and in the customs of English court life. Her lessons went beyond language. She was taught to curtsy in the English fashion, to prefer wine over ale at meals, and to behave in a manner befitting a queen. Even though she was still just a girl, the royal courtiers and attendants who cared for her were as much her guardians as they were her educators, shaping her not only to be a queen but to be a representative of peace, a living symbol of the fragile truce between England and France. Richard, her husband, though far older, took a keen interest in Isabella's education. He visited her regularly in her chambers, bringing her gifts from across his realm, exotic birds from Ireland, fine books from Oxford, and musical instruments crafted by London's finest artisans. These visits, though often formal, held an underlying tenderness. Richard, despite his political struggles and the growing dissatisfaction of his court, took care to ensure that Isabella felt secure and valued in her new home. For him, there was a paternalism that appeared in the way he cared for her, a recognition of her youth, her fragility, and her need for guidance. The young queen, in turn, began to grow accustomed to Richard's visits. She would greet him with a formality that mirrored the rigid structures of royal etiquette, but also with a warmth that came from their growing bond. As a child, Isabella's understanding of Richard's position was limited, yet she sensed his kindness toward her. There was an unspoken connection between them, one that was born not of love, but of mutual respect and recognition of their shared responsibility to ensure the future of both their kingdoms. Though still a child, Isabella was quickly integrated into the rhythm of royal life. She joined the other children at court, especially Margaret Holland, the daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret, though only 2 years older than Isabella, quickly became a companion and a guide to the young queen. The two girls would spend hours together, playing in the gardens of Westminster, their laughter filling the air as they practiced needlework and learned about the complicated web of English noble families. Margaret's lessons were often less formal than those of the court tutors, but they were no less important. She taught Isabella not just about etiquette, but about the subtle dynamics of court politics, the way the nobles watched one another, the way allegiances shifted, and the undercurrents of power that ran just beneath the surface. It was Margaret who first explained to Isabella the tensions within Richard's court, the growing discontent among the nobles, and how many of them viewed Richard's rule as weak, particularly his preference for negotiation over military conquest. "The king is powerful now," Margaret said one afternoon as they sat in the garden. "But power in England must be shared with the nobles. Your marriage helps him, but some think it shows that he prefers peace over war." Isabella, despite her youth, was an astute listener. She absorbed these lessons, sometimes with a child's simplicity, but often with a quiet understanding that suggested she was beginning to grasp the complexities of a new world. She began to observe the nobles who frequented the court, noticing the way they subtly aligned themselves with one another, the way they avoided speaking their true thoughts in public, and how often their opinions changed depending on the king's decisions. These were lessons in power, and though she did not yet fully comprehend them, Isabella was learning the language of royal politics. But the court was not just a place for education and political maneuvering. It was also a space of curiosity, where Isabella's youth and beauty captivated those around her. Nobles, curious about their new queen, would often gather to watch her at court, murmuring about the child bride who represented the fragile peace between England and France. Some were fascinated by her, while others were skeptical, wondering whether such a young queen could ever wield real power or influence. These whispers, while soft, reached Isabella's ears. She was beginning to understand that she was not just a queen by title. She was also a symbol of something larger, symbol of hope for the peace between two nations, but also of fragility, as her youth made her vulnerable to the political whims of those who sought to use her. Despite this, Isabella continued to grow in both stature and understanding. Her days were filled with lessons, but also with moments of exploration and self-discovery. She found comfort in her relationship with Richard, whose kindness and attention to her welfare provided her with a sense of security. But she also began to realize that her life was not her own to shape. The political realities of her position loomed large, and she would need to navigate the complex world of English court politics, where the noble's loyalty was constantly in flux. As the years passed and Isabella matured, her role as queen began to shift. She was no longer just the child bride of Richard II. She was becoming the queen consort, a partner in the governance of England, even if her power was still limited. The marriage, initially seen by many as a political necessity, began to take on new meaning as Isabella grew into her role. The people, though still uncertain about their young queen, began to accept her as part of the royal family. Her influence, though still subtle, would begin to show in the way she interacted with the court, in the alliances she quietly helped to form, and in the lessons she learned about the difficult art of balancing personal desires with the needs of the state. For Isabella, the path ahead was uncertain. She was caught between two worlds: the world of her childhood, which she had left behind in France, and the world of English politics, which she was only beginning to understand. But as she navigated this complex landscape, she began to realize the immense responsibility that rested on her shoulders. Her marriage to Richard had been meant to secure peace between England and France, but it was becoming clear that her role would be more than that of a diplomatic figurehead. In time, she would come to play a part in the governance of England, and the choices she made, though still guided by Richard's leadership, would have lasting consequences for the future of both kingdoms. Despite the political and diplomatic nature of their marriage, Richard II's relationship with Isabella grew in ways that were more personal than either could have anticipated. For Richard, the young queen represented both a political necessity and an emotional outlet. He had been devastated by the death of his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, and the prospect of marrying a child was, for him, a reluctant step. His marriage to Anne had been based on genuine affection, a rare bond in the royal world. To replace her with a young girl, especially one so far removed from the emotional closeness he had known, felt almost like an act of betrayal. Yet as the years passed and Isabella matured, Richard's feelings toward her began to evolve. Despite the political framework that defined their marriage, he could not ignore the tenderness he felt for her. It was not the deep love he had shared with Anne, but there was something maternal in his affection for Isabella's sense of protectiveness that shaped his relationship with her. Richard, already under the strain of ruling a divided kingdom, began to see Isabella less as a political tool and more as a figure he could care for, someone he could nurture and protect in a world full of shifting loyalties and threats. For Isabella, the relationship with Richard was one of complexity. As a young child bride, she had not fully understood the ramifications of her marriage. She had been raised in the court of a mad king, surrounded by chaos and uncertainty, and thrust into a political union far beyond her control. But as she grew, she began to see Richard not just as her husband, but as the king who was guiding her into the world of English politics, a world where survival meant learning the delicate art of balancing personal feelings with the greater good. Richard's affection for Isabella, though rooted in duty, began to take on more significance as time passed. He was no longer just a king trying to fulfill his royal obligations. He was a man who had lost much in his life: his first wife, his sense of security, his power over a restless court. Isabella, though still a child in many ways, offered him a sense of emotional stability. In their private moments, he would speak to her softly, taking the time to ask how she was adjusting to life in England. His gestures were often gentle, even fatherly, as though he understood the weight that rested on her small shoulders. But the political pressures Richard faced soon began to take a toll on their relationship. The English court was divided, and Richard's reign had been marked by increasing discontent among the nobility. He was constantly at odds with powerful lords who questioned his authority, and the peace he had fought so hard to secure through his marriage to Isabella was fragile at best. As the years went on, Richard became more distant, not just from Isabella but from his court as well. The pressures of ruling, the constant challenges to his power, and the growing unease in England made it difficult for him to maintain the warmth he had once shown Isabella. For Isabella, this distance was difficult to understand. She had grown accustomed to the king's visits, the gifts he brought her, and the rare moments of tenderness he showed. But as Richard became increasingly consumed by the political instability of his reign, Isabella found herself standing at the periphery of his world, still queen, still a symbol of peace between two nations, but increasingly isolated. Her days were filled with courtly lessons and political observations, but her relationship with Richard began to feel more like a duty than a partnership. Isabella, despite her youth, was astute enough to understand that her role in the court was not solely to be a queen consort in name. She was, after all, the young bride of a king whose reign was fraught with challenges. She began to observe the politics of the court more closely, noting the way Richard's favorites held sway over him, and how the nobles seemed to watch every move he made with increasing scrutiny. The delicate balance of power within the court, which Isabella had been taught to navigate, began to shift. Richard, despite his deep affection for her, was no longer the king who had once made her feel safe in the foreign court of England. The pressures of his reign and the growing discontent among his nobles were pulling him away from her, and Isabella began to feel the strain of being a queen in a marriage that was as much political as personal. Yet, despite these growing tensions, Isabella never wavered in her role as queen. She continued to fulfill the expectations placed upon her, attending court events, participating in royal ceremonies, and maintaining her status as a symbol of peace between France and England. Though Richard had become more distant, Isabella understood the nature of their bond, one that was built not on affection but on duty. The political landscape of England, marked by constant rebellion and noble unrest, demanded a certain level of detachment from the personal lives of its monarchs. And though she was still young, Isabella knew that the survival of the peace she represented depended on her ability to maintain her position, regardless of the emotional complexities of her relationship with Richard. As the years passed, Isabella would come to understand the intricacies of her role more fully. She would learn that her influence in England was not to be found in the warmth of her relationship with Richard, but in the strength of her diplomatic presence. She was a queen not because of the love she shared with her husband, but because of the political alliances she embodied, a child bride who had grown into a queen consort, whose future was tied not to the personal affections of her king but to the greater forces of royal politics. Though Richard's reign continued to face challenges, Isabella's position at court remained secure. She was not a queen defined by the affection of her husband, but by the political significance of her marriage. And as the years wore on, she would come to realize that her role in this complex world of power, politics, and diplomacy was far greater than she had ever imagined. As the years passed and Isabella grew from a child queen into a more mature and aware figure in the court, the political landscape of England continued to shift and change. Richard II, despite his attempts to strengthen his position through diplomacy and political alliances, faced increasing unrest within his own kingdom. The discontent among the English nobility had grown steadily over the years, and whispers of rebellion became louder. Isabella, though young and often shielded from the harsher realities of royal life, began to understand that the peace her marriage represented was far more fragile than she had ever imagined. Richard's reign had been marked by increasing authoritarianism. His nobles, once loyal, began to question his leadership, feeling that he had grown too distant from them. His favorites, men like Robert de Vere and other court officials, became symbols of his perceived weakness, as many nobles felt Richard was too willing to elevate his personal favorites over the traditional power structures of the English nobility. To the lords of England, it seemed that Richard was ignoring the customs of governance that had kept the monarchy in check for centuries, and they began to grow resentful of his rule. For Isabella, this was an uncomfortable realization. She had been raised to understand the delicate balance of power within a kingdom, how rulers must maintain the favor of their nobles to survive. But Richard, despite his affection for her, seemed increasingly unwilling to bend to the needs and demands of his court. His isolation grew as he retreated from the courtly politics that had once defined his reign, and the turbulence in the kingdom deepened. As Isabella navigated her own royal duties, she could feel the tension mounting around her. At the same time, Isabella's relationship with Richard began to reflect the political climate of the time. Though their early interactions had been marked by tenderness, as Richard increasingly withdrew from the pressures of ruling, their connection shifted. He became more absorbed by the rebellion growing at the edges of his kingdom, and Isabella began to realize that her own role, once purely symbolic, was now taking on new dimensions. She was no longer just a figurehead of peace, she was now an integral part of the political framework of England. Her role, her actions, and her alliances could influence the course of events in ways she had not anticipated when she had first stepped into the role of queen. Meanwhile, the threat of rebellion grew, not just from Richard's nobles, but from within his own family. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who would later become Henry IV, had returned to England after being exiled by Richard. Henry's return was both a political maneuver and a personal mission, as he sought to reclaim his inheritance and, ultimately, his position in English politics. He had a significant following among the disaffected nobles, and his return posed a direct challenge to Richard's reign. Isabella, though a young queen, could not help but feel the mounting tension in the court. She overheard conversations between nobles, discussions of power and rebellion, and whispers about Henry Bolingbroke's ambitions. At times, she caught Richard staring out of the window of her apartments, lost in thought, clearly preoccupied by the growing threat to his reign. For the first time, she sensed that the safety of her position was not as secure as it had once seemed. She was no longer just a symbol of peace. She was a piece on the political chessboard, one whose future would depend not on her own actions, but on the shifting allegiances of the men around her. The realization that her marriage to Richard, once seen as a hopeful union that would bring peace between two warring nations, had become entangled in the complex web of English politics was a sobering one for Isabella. She had not asked for this role. She had not chosen to be thrust into the world of power struggles and rebellion. Yet, as her own understanding of court politics deepened, she began to see that she had a role to play in the outcome of the turbulent times. She began to observe the way the nobles interacted with her, how they spoke to her, and treated her as an extension of Richard's power. For Isabella, the shifting political landscape of England meant that she had to be more than just a queen. She had to learn how to navigate the dangerous world of court intrigue, where loyalty could change in an instant, and where even the king's closest allies might turn on him. Richard's political isolation was becoming more apparent with each passing day, and Isabella could feel the burden of their marriage weighing on her. She was no longer just a young bride in a foreign court. She was the queen consort, and the future of England rested, in part, on the choices she made and the alliances she forged. The tensions between Richard and his nobles would soon come to a head, and the outcome would shape the course of history for both Isabella and England. The young queen, whose life had once seemed destined to be one of ceremonial duty, was about to find herself at the center of a political storm. As the growing rebellion led by Henry Bolingbroke gathered momentum, Isabella would have to decide where her loyalties lay, not just with her husband, but with the kingdom she had sworn to serve. In the coming months, Isabella would come to realize that her marriage to Richard was more than just a political alliance. It was the hinge on which the fate of England might turn. And as the storm of rebellion gathered strength, she would find herself caught between the powerful forces of the English court and her own sense of duty to her country, to her king, and to herself. The calm of Isabella's early years as queen had been shattered. The tension at court, which she had sensed growing over the years, was now palpable in every interaction, every whispered conversation behind closed doors. As Richard's reign continued to unravel, the walls of Westminster seemed to close in on the young queen. The once grand court, which had witnessed her coronation with such pomp and hope for peace, now felt suffocating, an arena where power plays were made not just with words, but with alliances, betrayals, and subtle maneuvers. Isabella, though still a child in many ways, was beginning to understand the gravity of her situation. No longer just a symbol of royal union between England and France, she was now a political figure in her own right. The increasing estrangement between Richard and his court was difficult for her to ignore. Her husband, once a king who seemed to care deeply for her, had become increasingly distant, absorbed in the political strife that was tearing at the fabric of his rule. His advisors had warned him of the growing unrest among the nobility, but Richard's response had been one of isolation rather than confrontation. His once proud court was now divided, and his inability to mend the rift had only deepened the discontent among his lords. Isabella watched from her position at the center of it all. She had once been the child bride, curious about the intricate rituals of court life, unsure of her place in the ever-shifting political landscape. Now, at the age of 9, she was becoming more aware of the dangers that surrounded her. Her role as queen was no longer a ceremonial one. Isabella had learned that in the world of medieval politics, nothing could be taken for granted, not the loyalty of the court, not even the safety of the king. The atmosphere in the palace grew increasingly tense as Richard's rivals gained power. The nobles who had once been his most loyal supporters were now murmuring against him, openly criticizing his rule and questioning his ability to govern effectively. In the shadows, Henry Bolingbroke, Richard's cousin, was gathering support for his return to England after his long exile. Bolingbroke's cause was one that resonated with the disaffected nobles, and his support grew by the day. Isabella could feel the weight of these changes pressing on her. The court that had once seemed so full of possibility, with its grand feasts, music, and art, now felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Her position as queen was increasingly precarious. She was no longer just the young bride who had married Richard to seal peace between England and France. She was a symbol of his reign, and that reign was in deep trouble. Her every move, every word, could be scrutinized, twisted, and used against Richard. The first signs that something was amiss came quietly. A few of Isabella's French attendants, who had remained loyal to her since her arrival, began to act strangely. They would exchange looks in hushed voices, and their demeanor seemed more distant, almost guarded. It wasn't long before Isabella learned that several of the French nobles who had been sent to England with her had disappeared during the night. She was told little of their fate, but the rumors that followed made her heart heavy with dread. The discontent among the nobles was no longer a mere undercurrent, it was becoming a raging tide. Richard's reign was on the brink of collapse, and the pressure mounted daily. The English court was beginning to fracture, and Isabella could see it in the eyes of the courtiers when they looked at her. The royal household, which had once welcomed her as the new queen, now seemed full of suspicion. Even her relationship with Richard, once a refuge from the political tensions, began to feel strained. The king was becoming a shadow of the man he had once been, stressed, preoccupied, and at times, seemingly lost in thought. One evening, as Isabella sat in her private chambers, she noticed Richard standing by the window, staring out over the city. His back was hunched, his face pale, as though the weight of the kingdom was pressing down on him. Isabella, feeling the distance between them growing wider with each passing day, approached him hesitantly. She had been taught not to interfere in matters of state, to remain a figurehead for peace, but in this moment, she felt compelled to speak. "Richard," she said quietly, "are you well?" Richard turned to her, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. "Do you feel it too, Isabella?" he asked, his voice heavy. "The storm is coming. There is no peace to be had, not for us. Not for me." Isabella's heart sank as she understood the depth of his despair. He had always been the king, the ruler of England, the one who was meant to guide the country through its darkest moments. But now, it seemed, even Richard had lost his way. "You are not alone," Isabella whispered. Though her words felt inadequate, she wanted to reassure him, to offer comfort, but she too was unsure of what the future held. She had grown into a queen, yes, but she had not been prepared for the cruelty of royal politics. The complex web of power that surrounded her, and the shifting allegiances within the court, were forces beyond her control. That night, as Isabella lay in her bed, she could not shake the growing sense of unease that had settled over her. The following morning, the news she had feared arrived. Henry Bolingbroke, the man who had been exiled by Richard, was back in England, and he was marching toward London with an army at his back. The whispers had become a roar. The king's cousin, once a part of the royal family, now sought the throne for himself. Isabella had been raised in a world where peace was negotiated through marriage and alliances, where the future of entire nations could rest on the shoulders of a young girl. She had always been a pawn in this grand game, but now she was more than that. She was the queen, and the kingdom she had married into was on the brink of collapse. Her fate and the fate of the kingdom was now inextricably tied to the rebellion that was sweeping through England. The news of Henry Bolingbroke's return struck the court like a thunderclap, reverberating through every hall and chamber of Westminster Palace. Isabella could feel the tremor of unrest beneath her feet as whispers filled the air, carrying with them a growing sense of inevitability. The very foundation of Richard's rule seemed to be crumbling, and with it, Isabella's once secure position as queen seemed to waver. The king, once so determined to hold on to his power, now seemed trapped within the walls of his own court. His advisors, who had once rallied around him, were now split, with some openly supporting Bolingbroke's claim and others loyal to Richard. The battle for the throne was no longer a distant concept. It was happening right in front of Isabella, and the stakes were painfully clear. If Richard fell, so too might she. The fragile peace between England and France, symbolized in her very person, was on the verge of shattering. And Isabella, still young and uncertain of her role, had no choice but to watch as the world around her began to unravel. As Richard retreated further into himself, isolated by the political turmoil surrounding him, Isabella found herself caught between two forces: her allegiance to her husband, the king, and the ever-growing power of Bolingbroke, who now had the support of much of the nobility. Though Richard had once shown tenderness toward her, his growing preoccupation with the political crisis left little room for their earlier connection. He no longer visited her with the same frequency, and when he did, his demeanor was distant, as though the weight of the crown had become too much to bear. The courtiers who had once showered her with attention now treated Isabella with a mixture of pity and wariness. She was no longer just the young queen who had come from France to seal a treaty. She was now a symbol of a kingdom in turmoil, and as the rebellion against Richard gained momentum, the nobles around her began to question whether she might be of more use as a political pawn than as a queen consort. Some whispered that if Richard was overthrown, Isabella's future would be uncertain. She could either be sent back to France or used as a bargaining chip in negotiations for peace. The growing sense of helplessness in the palace began to consume Isabella. For the first time since arriving in England, she began to feel the weight of her position. She was no longer the child who had been crowned in a grand ceremony, nor the young queen who had been the symbol of peace. She was a woman caught in the midst of a political storm. And as her husband's grip on the throne weakened, so did her sense of security. One afternoon, as Isabella walked through the corridors of the palace, she passed a window that overlooked the grounds. She could see the distant horizon, where the banners of Bolingbroke's supporters were already visible on the horizon, signaling the approach of a new era. Her heart tightened in her chest as she realized that the future was no longer in her control. Her marriage to Richard, once seen as a symbol of hope, had become a political liability. Richard's situation continued to deteriorate. His reign, which had once seemed so secure, now hung by a thread. His position weakened further as Bolingbroke's forces marched toward London, and the realization that Richard's rule was likely coming to an end became impossible to ignore. The young queen, caught in the whirlpool of political upheaval, began to feel the full weight of her precarious situation. She was no longer just the daughter of a mad king, a child bride forced into a marriage for peace. She was a woman trapped in a political game where the stakes were nothing less than the crown itself. As Richard's forces began to falter, Isabella was brought to the Tower of London, where she was told she would remain for her own safety. The Tower, once a place of refuge for England's royals, now felt like a prison. The familiar faces of her French attendants, who had always been her link to home, were now few and far between. The English nobility, who had once treated her with reverence, now viewed her with suspicion. Though she was still queen in title, she could no longer ignore the fact that her status was entirely dependent on the will of the men who now controlled England's future. Her time in the Tower was a time of reflection. As she walked through the cold stone halls, she thought of her home in France, of the mother who had placed her in this foreign land to secure peace. She had never truly asked for this life. She had never asked to be married to a man so much older than her, nor had she ever envisioned herself as a queen caught in the crossfire of royal politics. But now, with Richard's fate sealed and Bolingbroke rising in power, Isabella understood that her future was no longer her own to shape. She was not just a queen, she was a piece in a larger game, one that could be discarded or reshuffled at any moment. Days turned into weeks, and the political situation only worsened. News of Richard's deposition began to reach Isabella's ears. The whispers were growing louder, and the rumors that Richard had been forced to abdicate in favor of Henry Bolingbroke soon became fact. The king, her husband, had been dethroned. He had been stripped of his crown, and Isabella was now caught between her loyalty to him and the stark reality of the new political order that was unfolding around her. The moment of truth came when Henry IV himself arrived at the Tower. Isabella was summoned to meet him, and as she stepped into the room, her heart raced. Henry, now the new King of England, stood before her, his eyes calculating, his posture rigid. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, sizing her up, before he spoke. "Your Grace," Henry said, his voice formal, "I regret that circumstances have led to this. The peace we sought through your marriage to Richard is no longer possible. You will be returned to France, as is customary for the widow of a king. But I must ask you to swear loyalty to me, as the rightful King of England. Do you understand?" Isabella's heart sank as she realized the weight of his words. She had been a queen, but now she was nothing more than a political tool, a bargaining chip in the negotiations for peace. Her fate, it seemed, was tied to the whims of the new ruler of England. She was forced to make a choice, to accept her exile and return to France, or to refuse Henry's demands and risk remaining a prisoner in England. She knew that whatever decision she made would shape not only her future, but the future of the fragile peace she had once symbolized. Isabella stood before Henry IV, her heart heavy with the weight of the moment. The room in the Tower was dim, the stone walls cold and unyielding, much like the decision she now had to make. She had once been a symbol of peace between two great nations, but now, as the world around her had changed, she found herself at the mercy of a new power that had risen from the ashes of Richard II's reign. Henry, now the King of England, was offering her a chance to return to France, but at a steep cost. She must acknowledge him as the rightful ruler of England and renounce any claims she might have had as Richard's queen. For Isabella, the choice was not simple. She had once sworn allegiance to Richard, her husband, her king, and though their marriage had been born out of political necessity, it had also been marked by moments of genuine care and tenderness. Richard had, despite everything, been a protector to her in his own way, and now he was gone, cast aside in favor of his cousin, the man standing before her. The bond she had with Richard could not simply be erased, and the thought of aligning herself with Henry, whose forces had overthrown her husband, felt like a betrayal of everything she had once believed in. But Isabella was not a woman to act rashly. The lessons of her childhood had taught her the importance of survival in a world where politics and power shifted like the tides. She had been raised to understand that the personal could never be separated from the political, and her position as queen, despite the turmoil of the moment, was still significant. The question now was how to navigate this new reality. Would she return to France, accepting the role Henry had laid before her, or would she refuse to bend to the demands of the new king and risk remaining a prisoner in England? For a moment, Isabella said nothing. The silence between them felt suffocating, and the weight of her decision threatened to crush her. Henry watched her closely, his expression unreadable. She knew that he was calculating, trying to gauge her response, but what was he really offering her? A chance to return to France, to reclaim her life as the daughter of a troubled king, or something more insidious, the acknowledgement that her marriage to Richard had been nothing more than a political transaction, and her role as queen had been nothing but a pawn in the game of power. Finally, Isabella spoke, her voice calm but resolute. "I will return to France," she said softly, "but I do not swear loyalty to you, Henry. I swear loyalty only to the peace that my marriage to Richard sought to bring. I will not renounce my role as his queen, even if his throne has been taken from him." Henry's gaze flickered for a moment, his lips tightening as if in frustration. He had hoped for her full cooperation, for her willingness to acknowledge his rule in exchange for her release. But Isabella, despite her youth and vulnerability, had held firm. She understood that her future was uncertain and that the security of her position was now in jeopardy. but she could not and would not deny the truth of her past. She had been Richard's queen, and no matter how the politics of the realm had shifted, that truth could not be undone. Henry did not reply immediately, but his silence spoke volumes. He understood the diplomatic message Isabella was sending, but he also knew that her decision would have repercussions. She would return to France, but her position in the court of Charles VI, her father, the Mad King, would be precarious. The French too would see her as a symbol of England's lost peace. Whether they would welcome her as the queen who had been discarded by the English, or as a diplomatic asset in future negotiations, Isabella's fate was now entirely out of her hands. Within days, arrangements were made for her departure from England. She would be escorted back to France, though not in the splendor of her coronation procession, but quietly, as a royal widow with a history she could never forget and a future she could only imagine. The once thriving English court, with its intricate webs of power and intrigue, seemed a distant memory as Isabella was led out of the tower. As she departed from the cold stone walls that had held her captive, Isabella could not shake the sense of finality. She was leaving behind a kingdom she had never fully understood, but one that had shaped her into a woman far stronger than the child who had first arrived in England. Her journey was far from over, but she could feel the weight of her past pressing down on her every step. She was no longer the Queen of England, a fragile symbol of peace between two nations. She was a woman whose destiny was no longer in her own hands. The journey back to France was long and quiet. Isabella's thoughts often drifted to Richard, to the moments of tenderness they had shared in a marriage that had, despite its political foundation, held moments of genuine care. His loss was still fresh in her mind, though her resolve had solidified in the months since his deposition. The world had changed, and so too had she. But one thing remained clear: her role in history, her legacy would not be defined by the tumultuous end of Richard's reign. She would take what remained of her position, her royal blood, her heritage, and find a way to shape her own future. Upon her return to France, Isabella was met by her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, and the fragmented French court. Charles VI's mental state had worsened in her absence, leaving Isabella with little support in the very court that had once promised her protection. As her father's madness deepened, Isabella found herself in a new kind of prisoner, diplomatic pawn in the hands of those who wished to use her for their own ends. But Isabella was no longer the helpless child who had been married off to secure a treaty. She was a woman of experience, shaped by the political intrigue of England, by the collapse of her marriage, and by the harsh realities of court life. In the coming years, she would navigate the treacherous waters of French politics, using her experiences to carve out a place for herself. Her political insights, born from her time in England, would become her greatest asset, and she would learn to navigate the factions of the French court with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. The road ahead was uncertain, but Isabella of Valois was no longer just a figurehead in a royal marriage. She was a queen in her own right, one who had survived the collapse of her marriage, the betrayal of her king, and the shifting tides of European politics. The future, though still full of uncertainty, was now hers to shape, and though she had lost her place as Queen of England, Isabella was determined that her story, her legacy, would be defined not by what she had lost, but by what she would build in the years to come. Upon her return to France, Isabella was confronted with a new reality, one that was as complex and uncertain as the one she had left behind in England. The political landscape in France, much like in England, was fraught with division. Her father, Charles VI, was no longer the king he once was. His bouts of madness had become more frequent and severe, and the stability of the French crown was now at risk. The once protected princess, who had been promised a future as a powerful queen, found herself in a precarious position once again, surrounded by intrigue, shifting alliances, and a royal family torn apart by internal strife. Isabella was met with the cold embrace of the French court, where her presence was more of a symbol of lost potential than a mark of royal power. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was no stranger to political maneuvering. A woman of sharp intellect and ambition, Isabella understood the value of Isabella's position, but also the precariousness of it. She had spent years consolidating her own power in a court dominated by the fragile mental state of her husband. But now, With Isabella's return, the situation had become even more complicated. The French court, divided between factions loyal to the king and those who saw Charles VI's madness as an opportunity to seize power, left Isabella caught in the middle. The political tension in France was palpable. Isabella, though still young, understood that her status as the widow of Richard II could make her a pawn in a larger political game. Some at court saw her as a useful tool, someone who could potentially be married off again to solidify an alliance, while others viewed her with suspicion, seeing her as a reminder of a time when England had been a powerful adversary. Her marriage to Richard had been meant to secure peace between the two nations, but now it seemed like a distant memory, an ill-fated alliance that had crumbled under the weight of internal betrayal and external forces. Isabella's place in the French court was tenuous at best. Despite being the daughter of the king, her mother's influence was often more powerful than her own. Isabel, ever the political strategist, understood that Isabella's value lay not in her personal happiness, but in her ability to serve as a bridge between France and the outside world. But Isabella, now older and more experienced, began to question the cost of such a role. She had seen firsthand the manipulation that political marriages and alliances could bring. Her own experiences in England had shown her that loyalty and affection were secondary to power and diplomacy. The woman who had once been a child queen was now learning to navigate the dangerous waters of royal politics. Her mother, ever the calculating figure, saw her daughter not as a grieving widow but as a political asset, someone who could still play a vital role in France's future. She began to groom Isabella for the possibility of remarriage, offering her 2 suitors from across Europe. The alliances that could be made through such a marriage were invaluable to the French crown, and Isabella's royal bloodline was still a potent tool in the game of European politics. But Isabella, though she felt the pressure of her mother's ambitions, was not ready to follow the path laid out for her. She had learned too much in England, where her life had been dictated by the whims of the court and the politics of power. She wanted more than just to be used as a pawn. Isabella began to speak with more confidence, her voice gaining strength as she grew older. She was no longer just a young girl who had been married to Richard II in a political arrangement. She had experienced loss, betrayal, and survival. These experiences had shaped her into a woman who was capable of making her own decisions. She began to resist her mother's push for another political marriage, feeling that she could contribute more to France's future in a different way. It was not easy, and there were moments of tension between them, but Isabella knew that if she were to have any future of her own making, she would have to carve it out for herself, free from the manipulation of those around her. Her first real test came when the civil war within France, spurred by the factions vying for control during Charles VI's periods of madness, escalated into violence. The rivalry between the House of To which Isabella's family belonged, and the House of Burgundy threatened to tear the kingdom apart. Isabella's role in these disputes became more apparent as her influence began to grow. The once innocent girl who had been married off for the sake of peace now found herself at the center of a political storm. Her mother, who had been working behind the scenes to support the faction, saw Isabella as a crucial figure in maintaining their hold on power. Isabella's diplomatic skills, honed during her time in England, were put to the test. She became more involved in court politics, often acting as an intermediary between conflicting factions. Her position allowed her to build alliances and use her knowledge of English politics to gain insights into the strategies of France's enemies. She began to navigate the treacherous waters of French politics with increasing skill, even though her father's mental state remained a constant challenge. The French court, though unstable, was now beginning to recognize Isabella not just as a royal pawn, but as a capable and intelligent woman who could play a critical role in the survival of the faction. Her ability to survive in such a volatile environment was a testament to her resilience. The experiences she had undergone, losing her husband, facing the collapse of her marriage, being exiled, and witnessing the inner workings of 2 courts, had shaped Isabella into a woman who no longer needed to rely on the protection of others. She had learned to use her wits and her position to navigate the dangerous, often deadly world of royal politics. But the challenges she faced were far from over. The tension between the and Burgundy factions continued to escalate, and Isabella was caught in the middle. She had to make difficult choices, aligning herself with one faction while maintaining the delicate balance of power that would ensure her survival. The stakes were high, and Isabella knew that any wrong move could result in her downfall. Her life in France was one of constant negotiation, not just with the powerful factions at court, but with herself. She had learned the value of self-preservation, but she also understood the cost of that survival. The woman she had become was no longer just a symbol of royal peace. She was a survivor, a queen in her own right, with the strength to face the political realities of her time head-on. Isabella's time in France, marked by the rising tensions between the and Burgundy factions, became a turning point in her life. No longer the young queen who had been married to Richard II for peace. She had evolved into a political figure whose decisions could impact the balance of power within the French court. As France descended into civil war, Isabella's role as a member of the royal family became ever more critical, and she found herself thrust into the midst of a conflict that threatened to tear the country apart. The war between the factions of and Burgundy had already deepened the political instability within France, and Isabella could feel the ripple effects in every corner of the court. It wasn't just a matter of familial loyalty. It was a battle for control of the French throne and the future of the kingdom itself. As the daughter of Charles VI, Isabella was a key figure, but her influence was tested at every turn. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, had long been a supporter of the faction, and her alliance with the group had solidified Isabella's place as a potential instrument in the ongoing power struggle. However, Isabella's own views on the Civil War, shaped by her experiences in England and her time as a political figure, made her cautious about blindly aligning with one side. She had learned through years of turmoil that loyalty to a faction or family could be both an asset and a danger, and she understood the value of maintaining a delicate balance. As the French court was increasingly polarized, Isabella walked a tightrope, pushing forward to support her family's cause, but also quietly considering the broader implications of the conflict. She had seen how ruthless the political landscape could be, and she refused to be drawn into the war without understanding its true costs. One of the most challenging aspects of this period was the mental deterioration of her father, Charles VI. His episodes of madness, which had started in his earlier years, now took a far more severe toll on the kingdom. The once great king was no longer a reliable ruler, and the French court had fractured under his instability. The regency was divided among several powerful factions, each vying for control, and Isabella's role, as a daughter of the king, became increasingly important, even as her father's authority dwindled. Isabella understood that, despite her mother's ambitions to strengthen the faction, her own survival in this volatile environment would depend on more than just political maneuvering. It would require personal strength and the ability to remain flexible amid the constant shifts in the court. The challenges she faced living under the shadow of a mad king, navigating a fractured court, and dealing with her own sense of isolation had shaped her into a woman of extraordinary resilience. She knew that in order to ensure her own position, and possibly even the future of her children, she would need to rise above the personal conflicts around her. Isabella's earlier experiences with political manipulation in both England and France had taught her to keep her own counsel, to hold her cards close to her chest. While others around her bickered and fought, Isabella quietly built relationships that were not solely based on bloodlines or immediate power struggles. She began to reach out to lesser-known but influential figures at court, seeking alliances that would help her stay grounded amidst the chaos. Through her diplomacy and growing sense of autonomy, Isabella found herself positioned as a crucial, though often unseen, player in the French court. Her marriage to Richard II, which had been negotiated for peace, had ultimately taught her the value of building alliances, something she had once thought of as merely a formality in royal life. Now, she saw them as lifelines. She knew how to read the room, to assess who had true power and who was simply positioning themselves for a moment of advantage. The rise of the Burgundian faction, led by Philip the Good, added another layer of complexity to the civil war. Philip's influence grew, and his strength became a direct challenge to the faction. Isabella was keenly aware that her family's control over the throne depended not only on the support of her mother's faction, but also on the internal unity of the befracted faction would be easy prey for the Burgundians, and Isabella, although cautious of taking sides too overtly, knew that her presence at court could help steady the warring factions, if only subtly. As the war dragged on, Isabella's role became more defined. She was no longer merely a symbol of royal unity. She was a political asset, someone whose actions carefully chosen could sway allegiances. Her ability to keep her emotions in check, her ability to read the mood of the court, gave her an edge over many of her contemporaries. She knew when to step forward and when to remain in the background, and as her power grew, so too did her ability to influence the course of events, though always from behind the scenes. Despite the upheaval, Isabella remained committed to ensuring that her children would grow up in a world less consumed by war than the one she had inherited. The lessons she had learned from her turbulent marriage to Richard II, from her time at the English court, and from her current life in France, shaped her vision for the future. She worked diligently to ensure that her son, Charles, and her daughters would be raised with a deep understanding of diplomacy and the complexities of court life. In a world marked by rebellion, she would teach them that survival often meant being adaptable and knowing when to trust others and when to trust only yourself. The war between the and Burgundy factions continued to rage, but Isabella was not merely a passive participant. She began to be recognized as a political force in her own right, a woman who had navigated the treacherous paths of royal politics and had come out stronger on the other side. Her name, once tied only to a brief and tumultuous marriage to a distant English king, was now associated with resilience, wisdom, and a quiet strength that had allowed her to survive in a world where many others had faltered. Yet, as the French Civil War dragged on, Isabella knew that the future of France and her own future remained uncertain. She had weathered storms before, but the political and familial battles still loomed large. The fragile peace she had once embodied seemed impossible to recover, and Isabella could only wait, watching the rival factions play their dangerous games, hoping for a day when she could emerge not just as a survivor, but as a ruler in her own right. As the years of civil war in France wore on, Isabella's influence at court began to solidify in ways that were both subtle and undeniable. The political landscape had shifted, with the death of Charles VI looming closer and the division between the and Burgundy factions growing sharper. Isabella, now in her late teens, had become not just a royal figurehead, but a seasoned political player in her own right. She had lived through enough political turmoil to understand the dangerous game of power, its subtlety, its shifting allegiances, and the sometimes brutal consequences of failing to understand the rules. With the court in constant turmoil, Isabella became a symbol of stability. Her role, once thought to be defined by marriage and diplomatic union, had evolved into one of true leadership. She was no longer just a daughter, a wife, or a queen consort. Isabella had become a political asset, one who could wield influence and forge alliances with a deftness that surprised even her most seasoned advisors. Her mother, Isabella of Bavaria, though still a formidable force at court, had become somewhat more distant, particularly as Charles VI's mental condition worsened. The Queen Mother, once the driving force behind the faction, now found her power slipping through her fingers as the faction's internal rivalries grew. But Isabella, with her keen political mind, understood that the family's future depended on not just maintaining power but also keeping peace within the fracturing faction that could not afford to fall apart. At a time when Burgundy was gaining ground, Isabella began to play a crucial role in unifying the faction, gathering support from influential courtiers and powerful nobles who had grown disillusioned with the chaos of the Civil War. In private meetings, she used her diplomatic skills to bridge the divides between rival factions, understanding that they could only survive if they stood united. Her ability to communicate with those at the heart of French politics, men who had once seen her as a mere pawn, transformed her into one of the most influential figures at court. Though her influence remained largely behind the scenes, Isabella's importance was undeniable. She was frequently consulted by her mother and by other leading members of the faction, not just for her royal blood but for her intelligence and sharp political insights. Many in the court began to see her not just as the daughter of a mad king or the widow of a former English king, but as a woman who could influence the future of France itself. Her ability to navigate the volatile court of Charles VI had earned her the respect of those who once viewed her as a figurehead. As Isabella continued to build relationships with the key players in the court, she quietly shaped the political decisions that would steer the course of the kingdom. She understood that alliances, even those that seemed unlikely, could prove invaluable in times of crisis. She sought out individuals who had the power to influence the political tides, but who were not necessarily aligned with the primary factions. Isabella's diplomacy knew no bounds, and she made use of every connection available to her, carefully cultivating relationships with those whose loyalty might shift based on the outcomes of the war. However, her political maneuvers were not without risk. Many at court viewed Isabella's growing influence with suspicion, particularly those who had hoped to use her marriage to further their own agendas. Her increasing power, coupled with her refusal to be treated merely as a tool of the faction, created friction with some of her peers. But Isabella knew that her role in the future of France was not defined by others' ambitions. It was defined by her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics and maintain a steady course for herself and her family. Amidst all this, Isabella found herself at a crossroads. Her growing political involvement brought with it not only power but also a sense of isolation. She had seen how quickly loyalty could turn to betrayal, and how the line between friend and foe could blur in the world of royal politics. The people who had once shown her kindness now viewed her as a figure of political significance, someone to be courted, manipulated, or feared. The alliances she had carefully built had made her stronger, but they had also made her more vulnerable. Despite the isolation, Isabella remained committed to ensuring her family's future. The lessons she had learned from her first marriage to Richard II had shaped her understanding of both power and the price of peace. Her role as a diplomatic figure was no longer one of passive compliance. She had taken on the mantle of a leader, determined to use her position to shape the future of France, even if it meant making difficult choices. Her relationship with her mother, though complicated, was one that demanded mutual respect. Isabella knew that while her mother had guided her to this point, it was her own decisions that would ultimately determine her legacy. As the war continued to rage across France, Isabella's role became even more critical. The political situation was volatile, and her efforts to mediate between the warring factions at court brought her both praise and resentment. Yet, even as tensions mounted and the war between the and Burgundy factions continued to escalate, Isabella's presence remained a steadying force. She had learned that her survival, and the survival of her family, depended not just on the allegiances she built, but on her ability to remain flexible in the face of overwhelming adversity. Isabella's political evolution marked a profound shift in her life. The once naive child queen, who had been married off to secure peace between England and France, had grown into a political leader capable of shaping the future of her kingdom. She had navigated the murky waters of royal politics, survived the collapse of her marriage, and emerged as a woman who would leave a lasting mark on history. And yet, her journey was far from over. The French Civil War was still raging, and Isabella understood that the future of France remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: she would no longer be a passive observer of her fate. She had found her voice and her strength in the face of turmoil, and as she looked to the future, Isabella knew that the path ahead would require every ounce of her diplomatic skill, her resilience, and her courage. The coming years would test Isabella even further, but she had already proven that she was no longer just a pawn in the game of royal politics. She was a player in her own right, determined to ensure that her family's legacy and her own would survive the storm of war and the shifting tides of power. Isabella's position at the French court had reached a delicate and dangerous juncture. She had proven her resilience and ability to navigate the complexities of court politics. But now, with the civil war between the and Burgundy factions at its peak, she faced a new challenge. The stakes had never been higher. The political landscape was no longer just about securing power for herself or her family. It was about the future of France itself, and Isabella had become central to the outcome. The civil war had escalated into a brutal conflict between the supporters of the family and those aligned with the Duke of Burgundy. The violence was beginning to tear France apart, and the once unified kingdom seemed to be on the brink of collapse. The nobility, exhausted by years of fighting, were looking for someone to guide them through the storm, someone who could offer hope in the midst of despair. Isabella had become that person, though she had never expected to bear such a weight. Her diplomatic efforts, which had once been aimed at securing her family's future, had now shifted towards saving the very kingdom she had been born into. She worked tirelessly, using her position as the daughter of Charles VI and the widow of Richard II, to forge alliances with key figures who held sway over the warring factions. Her efforts were not always well received. Many saw her as a figure of compromise, a woman who walked a fine line between opposing sides. Others saw her as a potential threat, a queen in her own right who could rally the French nobility to her cause if the tides of war turned in her favor. Despite the distrust that surrounded her, Isabella's ability to broker peace became more crucial with each passing day. She made it clear to the leaders of both factions that the war could not continue indefinitely. France needed unity if it were to survive. But her efforts, though noble, were met with resistance from both sides. The faction was hesitant to place their trust in a woman who had once been married to an English king, and the Burgundians were unwilling to accept any terms that would diminish their power. Isabella, however, refused to give up on the hope of peace. Her position at court grew more precarious as the war continued. The factions around her shifted, sometimes in unexpected ways. One day, an ally could become an enemy, and an enemy could turn into an ally. Isabella learned to navigate this volatile environment with increasing skill, using her intelligence and her ability to connect with people from all walks of life to maintain her influence. But even she knew that, in this game of power, trust was a luxury she could not afford. Everyone had their own agenda, and Isabella had learned long ago that her survival depended on her ability to outmaneuver those around her. In private, she often confided in her closest advisors about the burden she felt. The weight of the crown, even if it was no longer hers to bear, had never fully left her. Isabella was no longer just the wife of a king or the daughter of a mad monarch. She was now the de facto leader of the faction, a symbol of hope for those who still believed in the future of France. But that hope came at a cost. She had to make decisions that would determine not just the fate of her family, but of an entire nation. The political games she played were more dangerous than ever, and the consequences of failure were too dire to contemplate. As Isabella continued to navigate the shifting alliances, she also began to reflect on her own future. She had been forced into a life that she had never asked for, a life where power and politics often overshadowed personal desires. Her marriage to Richard II, though political in nature, had opened her eyes to the complexities of royal life. She had learned that survival required more than just loyalty. It required the ability to manipulate circumstances, to read the motivations of those around her, and to act with both caution and decisiveness. Isabella knew that, despite her growing influence, she could not change the course of the war on her own. The power struggles at court were beyond her control, and the ultimate outcome of the conflict would likely depend on the decisions of men who had been fighting for years. But she also understood that her role, though small in the grand scheme of things, was still vital. The survival of the faction, and of her family, depended on her ability to keep the peace alive for just a little longer, long enough for a breakthrough to emerge. In the midst of this, Isabella's personal life remained in the background, though it, too, began to change. Her time in the Tower of London, her brief years as Queen of England, and her subsequent return to France had hardened her. She had experienced loss, betrayal, and survival in a way few women of her time ever would. And though the power she wielded was political rather than personal, she had learned to balance the two. She was no longer the innocent girl who had been married off for peace. She was a queen in her own right, capable of using her intellect and influence to shape her own destiny. Isabella's story was far from over. The future of France was still uncertain, and the political battle she faced would only grow more intense. But one thing had become clear. Isabella of Valois, the young queen who had once been a symbol of peace between England and France, was now a woman who had fought for her place in history. She had survived the collapse of her marriage, the fall of her husband, and the tumultuous reign of her father. And as the civil war raged on, Isabella continued to fight not just for the survival of her family, but for a vision of peace that seemed, with each passing day, further out of reach. Her legacy, though still unfolding, was already becoming one of resilience, intelligence, and the refusal to accept the limitations imposed by her time. The wars, the betrayals, and the shifting alliances were part of the world Isabella had been born into, but they did not define her. She was determined to carve out a future for herself and her family, one that would be remembered not just for the political machinations of her life, but for the strength she had shown in the face of insurmountable odds.